Okay, hello everybody. Welcome. This is the China and the World program at Columbia University. I'm the director, Tom Christensen. We have a special guest here who I'll introduce in a moment, but I want to say that today's program is one of our early collaborations with the Institute for Global Politics at the School of International Public Affairs, and our program will be working more closely with them in the future. And my co-host Zoe Liu couldn't make it today because she had to be in China, right? So I'm hosting the talk today. We have a very special guest in Minxin Pei. He's a very old friend of mine, going back to when we were both in graduate student days. He's one of the most perceptive analysts of Chinese politics and foreign relations. He is the Tom and Margot Pritzker class of 72 professor of government and the George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College, which many of you will be familiar with. He got his PhD at Harvard University under the tutelage of the great Samuel Huntington, someone I benefited from knowing as well, and who held Minxin Pei in the highest regard. He told me that privately, how much he respected you as an intellectual. And he was also a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. And before he got his chair at his current chair at Claremont McKenna College, he was the inaugural Library of Congress chair there, right, on U.S.-China relations. He's published several books of great note. I'll just mention a couple of them. One of them is China's Trapped Transition, The Limits of Development Autocracy. China's Crony Capitalism, The Dynamics of Regime Decay in 2016, which I think is kind of probably a precursor to this one, right? In a sense, right? And then the Sentinel State, Surveillance and the Survival of Dictatorship in China, about the surveillance state in Beijing and around the PRC. And today he's going to present his new book, and it's really new. So usually I'm embarrassed when someone comes to present a book and I haven't read it yet, but this time I'm not, because it really just came out, and I'm a busy professor, so I can't be expected to have read it. But I really look forward to what you have to say about it. It's called The Broken China Dream: How Reform Revived Totalitarianism in China. So Minxin also taught at Princeton University, a place where I taught for 15 years, and he's won a lot of awards, but I don't want to waste everyone's time talking about all those awards. Just know this guy's won a lot of awards. And I'm really proud to call him a friend. I'm really happy to host him here at Columbia University. So welcome, Minxin, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Tom, for this very, very generous introduction. I'm very honored to be here to share with you the main ideas from this book. This book actually should be the sort of the concluding opus of my interest in China's transition. My first book was published more than 30 years ago. It was a much more optimistic take on China, called From Reform to Revolution. Second book was a lot less optimistic. The third book was desperately pessimistic. And this one, I think, sort of off the chart.
This one's even more pessimistic than
even more pessimistic. But of course, it reflects.
In the 2016 book, it's more pessimistic than Dynamics of Regime Decay. Wow.
This is, we're talking about sort of a reversion to totalitarian, right? Series. Yes. So, so I would address three sets of issues. One is, how did totalitarianism get revived in China? I'll explain why I use the controversial word totalitarianism in a minute. The second is, how come economic development, this just unprecedented speed and scale in the case of China did not lead to, as modernization theory would have us believe, political liberalization and democratization. And the third is how engagement between China and the West ended in confrontation. You cannot cause a strategic rivalry, strategic competition, or the nuclear war, but it's not a friendly state of affairs. So these are three issues, and I hope to get through them in the next 35 minutes. The central idea about for the book is really it's an old idea. It's past dependence. That is, decisions made in the early 80s and 90s would severely limit the options for future leaders, would make certain outcomes much more likely than other outcomes. I'm not saying that certain outcomes are inevitable, but the chances that China would go down a certain path are much greater than the chances that China would go down a different path. So in other words, the chances that China would head toward a direction in which reversion to totalitarianism was a possibility was much more bigger than others. So now, before I launch into my extended discussion of the book, I just want to say a few words about totalitarianism. It is a loaded concept. It is highly politicized because if you call a country totalitarian, that implies a very high amount of evil. That limits the kind of interaction you can have with that country. I do not want to sort of get down that path. This term is used here in strictly analytical terms, because you have dictatorship, authoritarianism is a very broad category. So you have to make a judgment call. Today's China closer to what I would call a garden variety autocracy, or a special form of autocracy, which is totalitarianism? And so I don't want to define totalitarianism for you, but based on what I've experienced, what I've studied, I think China today is closer to totalitarianism than to authoritarianism. If you have scale 1 to 10, 10 being 10 being totalitarian, 1 being authoritarian, China probably is a 6 or 7. It is not completely, because today's China does not have, is not dominated by communist ideology. So that is at least you take 1 point off. And the economy has really been sort of diversified from state control to the private sector. That's another point off. Then you can debate about the use of terror against the population, the use of purge within the regime. So in any case, I just want to sort of put sort of clarify the term a little bit. So it's so the first issue is, how come that after 4 decades of post-Mao reform, we're now talking about 45 years, 46 years, China went back to a form of totalitarianism? I have to say the Chinese leaders themselves never expected this. They thought in the 1980s, they saw the last version of totalitarianism. Chinese leaders did not want to. Communist Party leaders in the 1980s did not want to see another Mao-like figure. But that is exactly what they have today. The kind of elite politics has reverted, not 100%, but I would say 75, 80% to the Maoist era. So this is a very important question. I have 3 explanations. The first one is that you really have to ask this fundamental question: did totalitarianism ever go away in China? That is, was China in the last 40 years ruled under authoritarian rule? My answer is no. It was totalitarian institutions and totalitarian practices are 2 very different, distinct issues. When Deng Xiaoping began the Long March in the post-Mao era, the Long March of economic reform, he did not touch totalitarian institutions. He actually explicitly preserved totalitarian institutions. Remember his four cardinal principles. I mean, you go down the list. And that's it. But he did not continue totalitarian practices. In other words, my analogy is that he shut off the power to the totalitarian apparatus. So the whole apparatus, the whole system merely lied dormant. It was not dismantled. So when a future leader such as Xi Jinping came along, he did not have to rebuild the whole structure, a whole apparatus. All he needed to do was to flip the power switch, and the system, being intact, will spring back to life. I mean, this is what we saw. That's how the system got back so fast and so efficiently. So this is just one. I think because we, for a long time, we thought, well, the regime in China was neo-authoritarian, but it's actually more complicated because it's neo-authoritarian regime working on the basis of an intact, essentially intact totalitarian system. So that's one. And second, when you look at the changes Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues who were all victims of Mao, when they came back to power, one of their priorities was never again, was not to have Mao again. So they began to introduce so-called institutionalization reforms, age limits, educational requirements, term limits, what have you, and also explicit prohibitions against personality cult. They thought they had the problem taken care of with both rules and norms. But these things, later it turned out, were not effective. First of all, I have to say that enforcing rules and norms, even in a democratic society, is very challenging, as we are seeing today, right, in the US. But in a dictatorship, theoretically, actually, it's an impossible task because power is, by definition, in a dictatorship is not constrained. But in the case of Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues, they made several self-interested, I would say deliberate mistakes. That is, they left most provisions very vague. There was actually no limit on the age of a Politburo member. There was no limit on the number of terms a Politburo member or a Central Committee member can serve. So that's why, because in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping and other revolutionary leaders were aging revolutionaries. So if you apply age limit and term limit, these guys will have to go. So they did not want to leave the scene. So in order to preserve their power, they created gigantic loopholes for the future. So let's just be very careful. And even worse, they did not put in writing any explicit enforcement mechanisms. What happens if somebody would pursue personality cult? What would the party do? Nothing. It's strictly prohibited. But if you don't have explicit enforcement mechanisms, that's sort of very weak set of rules. So the question we ask, how come this system actually survived for 20 years? In the post-Tiananmen era, the system designed by Deng appeared to work very well. And for a while, the theory attributed to our dear friend and esteemed colleague, Andy Nathan, so-called authoritarian resilience, because I think it was, for a while, a lot of us genuinely thought the Communist Party accomplished the impossible, institutionalizing autocracy. So, but then when Xi Jinping came along, it was, I call this the house of cards. The explanation I have is that you have to look at to use the international relations theory, the balance of power. In the post-Tiananmen 2 decades, it's the very fragile balance of power at the very top, served like multipolarity, that so perform the function, effectively the function of checks and balances. That not a single faction was dominant enough to overwhelm other factions. So they had to deal. So they had to respect each other's security. So that lasted roughly 2 decades until Xi Jinping came along. So that's now another, I think, legacy of the Dengist era was his visceral hostility to liberal democracy. It's just consistent. In writing the book, I read Deng's speeches, and one thing came through very, very clearly. That is, he thought democracy was very bad for China. The reason was that he believed that democracy would slow down China's economic modernization. That's his opinion. The man was very pragmatic. He was thinking in those terms. But in order to preserve, so maintain his 4 cardinal principles, he consistently opposed or suppressed forces within the Chinese Communist Party and also within Chinese society. They would push for more civil society, more institutional checks and balances, which meant that within the party, there was no possibility of enforcing these rules. But outside the party, there was no third party enforcer, not a single that could enforce. So as a result, those rules could not, against the resumption of a dominant leader, could not be enforced. And then I think there's another problem with Deng Xiaoping's vision of new authoritarianism. Even though Deng is one of the most consequential leaders in Chinese history, and I would say he's made enormous contributions to the Chinese nation as a whole through economic modernization, taking China from the dark era of Maoism. His vision, his single-minded focus on economic development on the one-party rule had 2 fundamental blind spots. One was that he thought that a dictatorship would actually continue to modernize. He did not appreciate the idea that dictatorships would lose the incentive to marketize the economy, reform the economy, because if you push the economy in that direction, it would threaten the dictatorship's own control of economic resources. So at some point, there was a hard limit. That was explored in my second book, called The Limits of, I call this the transition trap. The other problem is that economic development under one-party control can lead to, and is almost bound to lead to, pervasive corruption. So the pervasive corruption, then you have to put weak institutional checks and balances, lack of enforcement mechanisms, and then the fact that after 20 years of economic reform under one-party rule, a large number of ruling elites were tainted, involved in official abuse, power, corruption. So they were all very vulnerable. So now think of this scenario. Somebody like Xi Jinping came in, the balance of power was sort of the only thing that was holding the top elites together was no longer there, because by that time, Jiang Zemin was too weak. He retired in his 80s. Hu Jintao was a weak character. A new group of people came in, no rules, institutions could check him. And then he faced rivals who could be investigated for corruption. That was a sort of an ideal situation for somebody with huge ambitions to monopolize or to gain political dominance again. So I'm not saying that Xi Jinping himself in the specific case is unavoidable. My my judgment call is that he's an accident waiting to happen. Why is he an accident? When you look at his rise to power closely, he was not an obvious contender until quite late in the game, until about 2007. So and he was really the compromise choice of factional
I was at the
rivalry.
State Department. I remember my boss came into the meeting and said,
Yeah.
"She is the man." They chose his she. 2007.
2007, yes. Yeah, that was actually a very sort of a
Yes.
close call. But if it were not Xi, another person likely would have taken China down the same path, if that path served that person's interest. And here I want to remind you of this character, Bo Xilai. Bo Xilai, what Bo Xilai did in Chongqing was on a small scale what Xi Jinping did in China. Yeah. So, and you also need to remember that for about 4 years, Bo Xilai encountered no resistance. Chinese leaders, all the top leaders, with the exception of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, only 2 leaders did not go to Chongqing to congratulate him on his Chongqing model. Xi went and congratulated Bo Xilai on the Chongqing model. So this actually is a warning sign. It is somebody who was definitely trying to bring back some form of Maoism, was engaging in policies, behavior that was clearly in violation of many of the policies and the norms of the post-Mao era. He got away with it until his police chief, until he made a mistake of slapping his police chief, and then we know what happened afterwards. So I think this is actually a very sobering reflection on how the post-Mao regime, in spite of itself, actually created the conditions for the return of totalitarian rule. Now, the second issue is how come rapid economic development in China has not led to political liberalization or democratization? Let me just give you some figures. It's just the kind of improvement in the standard of living in China is truly unprecedented. I grew up in China. I remember how poor China was in those days. So these are the numbers. If you measure in US dollars, 1979 per capita income is 184 US dollars. Today is 13,000. So we're talking about more than 70 times increase. Measured in PPP, purchasing power parity, the World Bank only began to use PPP in 1990. So 1990, we're talking about 35 years ago, China's PPP was about $1,000. Today is $27,000. So just massive increase. According to the popular version of our understanding of modernization, this kind of economic change, China should be a democracy, should be at least democratizing. But we see the reverse. So how do we explain this? First, I really want to clarify that the relationship between economic development and the emergence of democracy is a very complex one. The popular version is a gross oversimplification of the relationship between economic development and the emergence of democracy. The initial observation was made 68 years ago by Lipset. He just observed that wealthy countries tend to be democratic, but he did not explain. Subsequently, research on democratization and modernization has not really found the specific mechanisms through which how economic development actually would lead to political democratization. It's just we have some guesses that middle class, information revolution, but no firm conclusion. So in other words, is that our understanding of how modernization can lead to political democratization is actually not very advanced. But in the last 30-some years, scholars have actually looked at the so-called third wave cases of democratization. And this is what they found, which I think is very useful in terms of understanding why this development did not occur. First, when they looked at the actual relationship between level of economic development, which is per capita income, and the timing of a country's transition from dictatorship to democracy, it's totally random. In other words, any country at any level of economic development can become a democracy. There's no linear relationship. So that actually would sort of tell us that our conception of this linear relationship, the wealthier you are, the more likely you are going to transition to democracy, that relationship is an optical illusion. It doesn't exist in reality. What happens, the most consistent and reliable predictor in explaining the transition from dictatorship to democracy, in this case, is the fall of dictatorship. When you reflect on this, actually makes a lot of sense, because you open up a space. A dictatorship falls, you like flip a coin, at least half of the time you're going to get either a dictatorship, another dictatorship takes over, or a democratic government takes over. So that is the work done by a team led by Adam Schwarzsky, really outstanding scholar who now is retired. This was one of the most important contributions to our understanding of democratization.
And he said that wealth is important because if you have democracy and wealth, you're less likely to
exactly
to revert.
Yeah, to revert.
Yeah.
Now,
But
he's
not
saying that even that he's questioning.
Oh, okay, but we see some reversion.
Yes, we see that because his data stopped at 1990. So that's so that's at least I think that that helps to understand that no such linear relationship exists. So this is a very important contribution. The other contribution is by Sam Huntington, our late mentor and friend. He found that there's another variable. The most important development triggering democratic transition is the decision made by the elites to reform.
Yeah,
that is true. Because look at Soviet Union or others.
Taiwan.
If the elites do not decide that their days are up, they are better off governing or sort of living under democracy, yielding power, then democratization is not going to happen. Now, we know what happened in China after 1989. The Chinese Communist Party said, no, we're not going to yield power. They got rid of the liberals, the reformers in the regime. So the regime after 89 was very homogeneous in ideological terms. So that is why. So does this mean that modernization in China did not make a difference? No. Modernization in China, when you look at what actually happened on the ground, you have to say modernization did have a positive impact. The Chinese people have become much more aware, much more assertive, much more active. Before the Xi Jinping era, you look at lawsuits filed against government, popular protest, resistance. In that sense, modernization theory actually worked. But all these positive changes were happening on the periphery of the political system. As long as the center of the political system remains conservative, anti-democratic, it's not going to make much of a difference. Lastly, I just want to say a few words on this theoretical puzzle. That is, does the nature of the regime make a difference in a country's transition from dictatorship to democracy? Because now we have to deal with totalitarianism again. Lots of countries in the since the mid-1970s made a transition to democracy. But one category stands out. That is former communist regimes. Then here you have to sort of make one distinction between indigenous communist regimes, the Soviet Union, and non-indigenous or externally imposed communist regimes like Eastern Europe. What we saw is that in this group of countries, the non-indigenous regimes were overthrown quickly overnight. Then the Soviet, so the only indigenous communist regime, suffered the fate of experienced the reform to revolution dynamic. That is, it started in reform, then ended in revolution. The totalitarian regime was overthrown. So this raised the question: is that can totalitarian regimes be reformed? Even though we don't have a lot of cases where I have n equals 1, that's a problem, right? But if you look at the pre-1991 experience, the Soviet collapse experience, what you find is that even for that subcategory of countries, when they attained a relatively high level of economic development, Eastern European countries, if you look at their level of income, the former Soviet Union, their income was much higher than equivalent countries in developing countries. And they remained dictatorial under communist rule until the very last minute. So I, at some point, I hope I can do do a paper on this, that the totalitarian regimes are truly quite unique in the sense of their ability to control, and also in the sense of their determination to hold on to power. So this is, and finally, I would just want to say that economic development is also a double-edged sword. We tend to look at modernization only sort of from the perspective that modernization can produce forces undermining autocracy. We do not realize that modernization can also help autocracy. That is, in retrospect, how would modernization help autocracy? First, very easily, performance legitimacy, because it increases people's standard of living. Most ordinary people, they do not wake up in the morning and say, well, do I live in a democracy or not? They care a lot more about whether they have a job, whether they can put food on the table. So it's security, survival. So that's what, so the Communist Party obviously enjoyed that in the post-Tiananmen era. The second is that economic development also generates resources to enable the autocracy or the dictatorship to enhance its ability for social control. And that's what I dealt in my last book, the Sentinel state. Just imagine how Maoist era, they did not have the money to build the Great Firewall of China. Police, I in the process of researching that book, so the 1980s, I was looking at police records. They were saying, oh, we've added modern equipment. 1980s. Guess what modern equipment they were talking about? Telephone. Camera. A camera to take pictures of the crime scene. Now, if you go to China, of course, cameras everywhere. The AI and all this. So social control in a wealthy dictatorship can be several orders of magnitude more effective. And that's how they adapted to a new, much more mobile society. And finally, I think if you have resources, you can co-opt social elites. And that's what the post-Tiananmen regime did really well. So I think that explains why economic modernization in the Chinese context has not led to the kind of political breakthrough we were all hoping for. And now the last is a very sad topic, how engagement between China and the West ended in a very hostile outcome. I say this as a sad topic because people like me, myself included, certainly included, are beneficiaries of the engagement between China and the West. I could never have received one of the greatest educations in the world without this engagement. I would have probably stuck in a factory in China somewhere. So this, at a personal level, it's really very painful to reflect on this. But then, if you keep some intellectual distance, then you have some explanations. And I would say I would really blame China much more than any other factors. First, I think China's own concept of its place in the world, and on top of the Chinese Communist Party's ideological hostility and existential insecurity about its own power. If you put these two together, then it would be actually very, very difficult for the West to establish a very durable relationship with China. If China is powerful, if China is weak, it's okay. So that is one. So and another thing I want to sort of point out here, it's worth pointing out because today there's a lot of relitigation about sort of engagement. In writing the book, I actually read a lot of official documents, then speeches, because one thing that is out there is that China engaged in strategic deception. When you reread what they've said, I mean, Chinese leaders were very transparent about what they wanted to do. They said, we are going to make China great again. Once we are great, we're going to have more say in international affairs. I mean, this is just wait until we are powerful. I mean, that's the intention. And second, what they are saying is, what they said, Deng Xiaoping and others, that the current international order, economic order, political order, are not just. We will seek to establish a new order. So challenging the international order led by the US and its allies has long been a goal of China. It's not something that popped up only on the Xi Jinping. So it's and then third, even when engagement was in full swing, the party said we wanted a multipolar world. The hostile forces, external hostile forces, always harbored the desire to seek our destruction. It's against it. So in other words, they were very transparent about what they wanted to achieve, the kind of world they wanted. So now is hide and bide, Tao Guangyang Hui, a sort of a wise grand strategy. You can say it was wise, but I think it was very pragmatic because China was simply too weak to challenge the US. But all along, their strategy was to get their house in order, build up strength, and then they will have a say. You have to pay them some compliment. I mean, they actually succeeded in doing that. I think the trouble is that Xi Jinping probably violated Deng Xiaoping's dictate a bit too early. He challenged the international order much more aggressively. But again, when you look at sort of the trajectory of China's rise in power and Chinese behavior, there is a very close match. The more power they had, the more aggressive, the more assertive they become. In the second half of Hu Jintao era, Chinese foreign policy was becoming much more aggressive because it was much more powerful. The difference between Hu Jintao era and the Xi Jinping era was that Xi Jinping was much more aggressive, much more comprehensive, and much more systematic. The Hu Jintao era, I would say, a lot more tentative probing, but that was not the case on the Xi Jinping. Of course, what Xi Jinping did was to clarify the West's thinking about China. That was his role. Another thing I think we need to think seriously is what was the U.S. role in sort of China's rise and in creating the most serious threat or challenge to U.S. Primacy in the world. Again, today we hear what I would think a partial view, probably even deliberate partial view. The sort of the caricature version of this view is that the U.S. were engaged in engagement with China blindly, overlooking the risks, and then China took advantage of us. This version is not true. When you look at U.S. so-called engagement with China, I think the 1990s is a very interesting period because the revisionists, I call them, they would say the U.S. should start containing China in the 1990s. I think, are you joking about the 1990s U.S. unipolar moment? China's GDP was less than 7% of the U.S. We were talking about the peace dividend. Could there be political support within the U.S. and among allies for a preemptive Cold War with China? And China was actually not doing that much. I think it would be very, very hard, practically speaking. But the U.S. was not engaging China blindly in the 1990s. When you look at actual U.S. policy, it's always engagement with a security hedge. Economically, diplomatically, the U.S. did engage in China with the hope that China would be part of the post-war international order without another subversion of the Cold War. But the U.S. did not put all the eggs in one basket. The U.S. maintained its full military deployment. The U.S. maintained security alliances built during the Cold War era. That's why the Chinese were not lying when they say the Cold War, legacy of the Cold War in East Asia was not dismantled. So it was there. So the U.S., and I would say the U.S. went into this game with a high degree of confidence. At that time, I would say totally warranted. Because you look at the PLA, circa 1992, 1990, it was a peasant army. It did not have even a modern destroyer. It was it had to import all its weapons, most of its advanced weapons from Russia. So I think as the 1990s, you had a much more robust and justifiable ground for engagement with security hedge. Now, the more interesting story is the 2000s. 2000s, when you look at the rapid shift of power, it occurred in the first decade of this century. And what happened? I think by the early 2000s, the U.S. became aware of China's rapid rise. The Bush administration's national security advisors, you worked for them, they were aware. I think Connie Rice's piece in Foreign Affairs that China was a strategic competitor. It was out there. The puzzle is how come the U.S. did not start a policy of containment right away. I think we can only attribute that to the war in Iraq, the war 9/11, because I think the U.S. became strategically distracted. If you have to say when the unipolar moment was lost, probably it was that decade. And then on top of that, you have the 2008 financial crisis, which got the U.S. into this prolonged recession. So in that decade, at the beginning when the George W. Bush got into the White House, China's GDP was 13%. By the time he left, 8 years later, Chinese GDP was about 32%. So you saw this just major increase. And then another 4 years later, Chinese GDP was 50%. So it's really that period. And you look at Chinese behavior, it gave China a lot of confidence. That's how the idea that the West is declining, the East is rising, became some kind of animating guidance for policy. I've recently read about, I have not read the book, okay, this another Robert Blackwell and Richard Fontaine, they put out another book that the last decade was the last decade, the 2010s. They blame the Obama administration. Incidentally, this debate becomes very partisan.
Yeah.
So you have to sort of, I'm independent, so I can
Me too.
sort of bash both sides. You would say the Obama administration got into this in a very difficult position. Very difficult. Just the U.S. was not out of Afghanistan. The U.S. had this long recession. Could you take on China? And by that time, it was unclear that allies would go along. And but the U.S. did have a soft version of strategic competition. It's called pivot to Asia. They had that strategy, actually. So I would not say that we wasted the 2010s. Then you had the person who sort of ended engagement was Donald Trump, right? He ended initially not for security reasons, economic reasons, and then that led to full-fledged security competition. So today, if you say, do I prefer the world of 2016 or the world of 2025? I wake up every morning, I will pick 2016. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I have one domestic politics question, and I'll turn it over to the people, because I can talk to you on the side. And we talked last night, too. There was one figure in Chinese politics that kind of stuck out for me in the period after the 80s that you describe, and who was pretty outspoken, too, right to the very end. About the problems in China, and that was Wen Jiabao.
Yes.
So you knew what I was going to say, right? I'm giving you all the clues. Who's the person? It's like a game show. So what about Wen Jiabao? I mean, I know his family was famously
corrupt,
racked with wealth, right? And not probably wealth that they earned from their government salaries, right? But he himself had a reputation for actually caring about regular people. I remember I was in Zhongnanhai when the earthquake happened in Sichuan. And he left. He just left all the meetings. And he went out there right away. And like, we got to go. A lot of people are in trouble. And that was kind of his reputation. And then when he left office, he basically said, we're on a terrible path and we can't continue on this path. We need to make changes. And then you didn't hear from him again, right? Really, in public. So what about Wen Jiabao? Was he different than the standard Leninist that you're describing? And if so, why was he different, and how was he able to speak out the way he did and not get purged and damaged?
Here's a puzzle. It's sort of
the answer. It's a real question.
It's a real question. I think the last part of your question is easier to answer because purging a sitting premier is pretty tough.
Pretty tough. They got Zhou Yongkang. They got the top generals.
But they went after him only after. So now because if you go after some very serious figure, top 3 people, it's actually very even hard for Xi Jinping. Okay? So that's one. Now, this is about sort of I have to say he's probably one of the least studied Chinese politicians. he dared to say a lot of things because he did not have to do them. This is my cynical view. Because he, even though he was the premier, he actually had no power base. He was made premier largely because I heard that Zhu Rongji would not allow Wu Bongguo to be his successor.
So he was the fallback.
He's a oh my dead body, essentially, because Wu Bongguo was not capable, and instead, Wen Jiabao was not a capable premier. He under his own, he would say a lot of things, but when you look at what
I was never in a bad meeting with Wen Jiabao on foreign policy. I mean, he was super prepared.
Yes.
He was thoughtful. He was flexible.
Yes, but he, in terms of economic policy, his biggest legacy was the credit bubble, was the real estate credit bubble after 2008. They just unleashed the credit bubble, which sort of sustained the economy, but did
temporarily.
And
so it exacerbated corruption.
But I think he knew that he wanted to appear a very sort of different leader. I think that clearly sort of earned him a lot of popular support. But Chinese entrepreneurs did not like it because they knew he was sort of phony. Sorry, because he did not really sort of put real political capital on the line.
All right, thanks. Other people, please. Say who you are first. So mention those. Professor Pei knows with whom he's speaking. This is Chris.
Hi, Aaron Glasserman, UPenn Center for the Study of Contemporary China, but I live in New York, so I tend to make it uptown sometimes. Anyway, thank you very much. This was very interesting. 2 questions. First, I wanted to ask your sort of model of the never destroyed but somehow rebooted, re-energized totalitarian framework. What are the implications of the reboot for China's willingness to use force abroad, if any? How does that affect kind of not just aggressive foreign policy, but military intervention, hard power? And second, can you talk about the role of legitimacy in your model? Because you focused a lot on kind of elite politics and top-down and institutions, but does it matter at all that, my experience being in China is that many people, even as they acknowledge the sort of, they're pessimistic about the economy and so forth, they still have a lot of good things to say about the party. Does that matter, or does that not matter? Thank you.
I think the use of force, it really has to do with the decision-making process. I think in terms of China's position of hard power, that affects their risk calculation, right? But then you will have to sort of factor in into your thinking how Xi Jinping's political centrality or political dominance would affect the use of force. I think the only some historical reference, because we can only use how Mao decided to use force in resolving disputes. Under Mao, there were several instances, and the amount of power she possesses today probably is slightly less than Mao. But of course, you have to say
power internally. You mean not
power internally is that decision making, and so one thing against Xi is Mao was really experienced in terms of war fighting.
He was a general.
General. I mean, he led the Communist Party from political wilderness to victory. So that's. But in the case of Mao, Mao was quite deliberate. I would say Mao did not use force very rashly. Mao took risks, but Mao was not. So that's sort of how I would say that probably Xi would be not as careful as Mao, mostly due to the lack of experience rather than other.
So you think he's less likely to use force, but if he uses force, he's less likely to be restrained in how he uses it?
Well, I think
because Mao used force often, but like you said, in limited ways.
Yes, I think he would be less deliberate. That is, he would still be he's much more likely to make a mistake. Not necessarily that he's less likely to use force.
Oh, okay.
When he decides to use force, he is much more likely to make the wrong judgment call. Because Mao actually weighed, and Mao was surrounded by really some outstanding people, right? Very experienced generals. But when you look at who is providing military advice to Xi, it's a big question mark. So legitimacy, I would say today, probably the biggest legitimacy is still nationalism. That is, they look at China.
They're stronger.
Their athletes are winning medals. In my days, Chinese athletes were not even allowed to compete abroad. So I think this still matters. But we are only in year 3 of China's economic stagnation. Right, China's economic stagnation. Now, so low growth, what happened? Let's wait for another 2 or 3 years. And let's then see. I lived through the Cultural Revolution. Until Ling Biao's fall, people still saw Cultural Revolution was working. So I think we need to be a little bit patient. It takes time for complete pessimism seeps through society. At this moment, probably Chinese elites, a lot of elites, are pretty pessimistic.
Business elites, certainly.
Yeah, business. Intellectual elites too. Thank you. Thank you.
Do you choose?
Hi, thank you for giving the talk. I'm an undergraduate student here at Columbia. Yeah. So I guess my question is, given like the political context, and you did mention like the Chinese elites right now are like pessimistic, what do you think is the most rational thing for Chinese elite to do right now?
You mean elite inside the government?
No,
or
like
elite?
I guess like the new reach, right? Like the
new reach. Okay.
Yes, the new reach.
If you can leave. Okay. I just don't have we have to be pragmatic, right? That is safety. Very important, right? I think the smartest people among the nouveau riche are those who left early and left with some money. So that's, I think still today I will urge them to consider the exit option rather than the voice option.
Voice doesn't get you.
Voice doesn't get you anywhere. So that is, but those who cannot leave, I would say you just sit it out. You just protect yourself.
Okay.
There's just no point. Resistance is today, right now, is futile. I have to say this because you're dealing with a very, very powerful, determined, and ruthless system.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor, thanks for your lecture. And I want to ask, what do you consider the most serious human rights problems in the mainland China nowadays?
I think today you have to look at the Uyghurs, the Tibetans. I mean, if you consider they are Chinese, okay, so they are obviously the most repressed groups. If you do something, they lock you up for days, months. That is, that is very, very serious. Then I would say, now if you expand human rights broadly, then clearly journalists, academics. I might even include Communist Party officials. I really don't want to be a Communist Party official. Tomorrow you're told you committed some corruption and you are locked up. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I think the most serious human rights problem is the ongoing persecution of Falun Gong practitioners by the Chinese Communist Party.
That is your view, okay?
Yeah. And what's your opinion of Chinese Communist Party's ongoing persecution of Falun Gong practitioners?
No opinion. Thank you.
Oh, and one more question. So, what's your opinion about the Chinese Communist Party's transnational persecution and its infiltration and penetration of U.S. Yeah,
Yeah. I think
and of the U.S. media and the legal system?
I think the U.S. is I still believe the FBI is not wasting taxpayers' money. I think if there were those overseas police stations, the FBI will be onto them very, very quickly. And I think they've already sort of,
Yes, they've rolled up 6 of them. Well, 6 more. 6 more, but what percentage of the total is that? I mean, because these are not police stations. They're not
police stations.
But they're not arresting Americans. They're looking for Chinese.
They're looking for
overseas.
Chinese and sort of, they're, I think, acting mostly as tools of intimidation.
Yeah.
Yeah, as tools of surveillance.
Yeah, it's intense, though. It is intense. Like in Queens and places like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Professor Pei, so it's talking about reform and about the democracy. So I think one of the criteria will be whether the Chinese people have the right to vote, right? So fundamentally, but they never change, even though they call it reform for the last 40 years. So in nature, I think that the totalitarian or the authoritarian never change, right?
I wouldn't say this. But this is actually, you can be very critical, but you have to sort of look at the 1980s. I lived part of that. It was really free. Okay,
and there were elections, right? They weren't fair elections, but there were elections.
Let me give you. Xi Jinping was voted down as a candidate for the mayor of Xiamen. That was some sort of reflection of popular will, right? 1988. Then he was sent to Ningde to be the party chief because party chief did not have to be elected. And another, just to illustrate to you how things have changed and how better days we had in China. Xu Ziyong, one of the towering figures in Chinese human rights. This is a lawyer. In 2000s, before Xi Jinping, he ran for Haidian District People's Congress. He won twice. And he was allowed to sue.
Yeah.
So
it was a different time.
They're totally different, right? So I wouldn't say, because there were moments during which actually modernization theory appeared to be working.
Mm-hmm. So there was I'll just make a comment. There was a moment where they were experimenting with democracy at the rural level, local rural level, and people would get elected who weren't party members, and they would defeat party members. Yeah. And then someone explained to me why this was going to be limited forever. And that was that if you run in a village and you're Mr. Wang and you're running against Mr. Zhang, and Mr. Zhang is the party person, you can run against him and say, I'm a better person than Mr. Zhang, I can help you more, and you can get elected. But if you move that up to the county level or the province level, you have to have an organization. If you have an organization that's not the Communist Party, that will never be allowed.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So let people vote in a very, very limited local. I mean, remember Hu Ping even one time, right, joined the election in Qinghua in the Haidian Qu. So,
but almost those local officials who were elected who weren't party members had no control over the budget.
Yeah,
they couldn't control the money. Yeah. It was representation without.
This is like student union president.
Yeah. Yeah, so also maybe one last question. So also I want to see your comment about the newly released national security strategies, and what do you think about China-U.S. relationship in terms of the new strategy right now?
The national security strategy carefully, because I was on the road. I read reports about it. Okay, based on my reading of news coverage of the national security strategy, I saw it was all over the place. It's actually pretty hard to make a coherent sense of the strategy. That's what I think. On China, it depends on where you look. There are places Beijing would like. There are certain places Beijing does not like, right? So then they have to pick what they want to see. That's because you were not in the government. You did not know how to write.
My war.
There's a question online. Thank you for the engaging talk. In addition to modernization and economic development, would you also comment on the role of legal systems in this revival of totalitarianism? Legal systems don't seem to have emphasized by the ruling party in totalitarian regimes, whether in the Soviet Union or the German Democratic Republic, yet China's current leadership appears to continue to stress the significance of law and governance and even promotes its version of rule of law. Many thanks.
Yeah, well, what they're proposing or promoting is not rule of law, it's rule by law, totally different. I think the Chinese Communist Party made it very clear in the 1980s they did want a modern legal system, but that was mainly to facilitate economic development. So that's why they would sort of write commercial laws. They would try to do a better job in protecting contracts and so forth. But one thing they would not do, they would not cede courts, the legal system.
No independence.
No independence, the real authority.
We were pushing for.
The real authority it needs in order to be credible and effective. That is true. Today is much worse. Okay. There was a time when you could actually sue the government and win, where the government had to pay some lip service to the law. Now, again, it's really a big step backward today. Now, what you see is that a lot of speech activities can be criminalized. I was reading the New York Times yesterday. There's this fantastic artist who did some art, who made some work mocking Mao, and now he's going to be locked. He's going to be sentenced.
Yeah.
So they have new. It's very sad.
Yeah.
So that is a huge sort of a step backward.
Thank you so much for the really interesting presentation. My name is Mary Kwan. I'm a visiting scholar here at the History Department. And if I may ask you a question of historical conjuncture, you mentioned in your talk that if not for Xi, given the model you presented, another strongman would have taken China down a similar path. I was wondering if how you think that would affect the way the territorial aggressivity we are witnessing today, whether we would have expected a similar level of aggressiveness in terms of territorial disputes or maritime disputes.
Yeah. Okay. So here I sort of want to take a step back. That is, the timing could be different. I think when you look at 2007, had Li Keqiang being number one rather than Xi Jinping, I think history would turn out be quite different because he would not have been as aggressive.
And those were the two, right?
Those were the two top people. Yeah. So because Li Keqiang was another version of Hu Jintao, much more risk averse. Xi Jinping has a much bigger risk appetite. So I think, but as long as China has the power, I think its external behavior we should always expect it to be much more aggressive, because it's very hard for such a powerful country to be bound by rules. We're seeing what's going on, right? In our own case, so that is actually a very unfortunate outcome of China's rise as global power. But if you have a liberal, then it will be a very different story, right? Okay.
There's another question online. Thank you very much for your talk, Professor. You mentioned that President Trump officially ended engagement.
Yes.
Do you think that the Biden administration did more to keep things engaged?
No. The Biden administration actually put in place a much more thoughtful, comprehensive, and long-term containment or competition policy than Trump 1.0. And I think that policy turned out to be quite effective. But that policy is no longer in place.
It's hard to tell what President Trump 1.0 was going to produce, because I wrote about this in this journal called Great Decisions at the end of 2024, beginning of 2025. It came out, and the first Trump term, President Trump had cut a deal with China that he was lauding in public, saying we have this phase one economic deal, and it's going to open up
200 billion.
They're going to buy a bunch of our stuff, and we're going to get along with China, and it's going to be win-win. It was a very, very engagement, different version, because it wasn't based on WTO or norms or institutions. But he thought he had a deal, and then COVID broke out.
Yes.
And he realized COVID was going to cost him his presidency. Exactly. And then China that was the most ferocious the United States has been, since Tiananmen.
Yes.
And it was ideological. It was full court press. It was the Communist Party has to go down. And I don't that the Biden administration didn't do that, and the second Trump administration hasn't done that.
No. Yeah.
And I don't know whether we're in April we're gonna see a kind of greatest deal ever to return, or we're gonna see disappointment.
Disappointment,
and kind of ferocity. I don't know.
We don't know. Yeah, because I think today it's all over the place. As I said, the national security strategy, based on what I've read about it, is all over the place. Okay, good.
Yeah, you have to go. So,
yes.
So
thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna take him. Point him in the right direction, as promised. Thank you so much. Really great. It's really great. Really great.
Really, thanks for hosting this.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Come back.
So